Good afternoon, everyone. So happy to see so many people attending our seminar, our webinar this afternoon. We're discussing today with some really excellent speakers the question about the future of the European Green Deal in the context of the upcoming elections. And of course, we think about 2024 as a fairly important election year, not just in Europe, but across the world. And we want to reflect in this session today about why these elections matter for the European Green Deal, or even whether they matter for the European Green Deal. Over the last 5 years, we've seen particularly the European Parliament as a supporter of the European Green Deal. The last, say, 2 years, we've seen a bit more challenges coming in certain policy areas, whether that's nature or agriculture. And we've got questions about what this means for the future, also with the elections coming up. In particular, we should note that the next phase of a lot of the European Green Deal is implementation, which is sometimes a far more challenging aspect of policy legislation and to achieve than simply deciding on ambition levels. So there are certain challenges in the future that are written into the European Green Deal processes, but yet that comes also in the context of elections, for which we have certain polls showing fairly interesting or even dramatic changes expected in the political makeup and the political context, both in the EU and in member states. Now, this is the background for which we hope to have a stimulating discussion. For all of you who are participating today, you have the opportunity to pose questions to our panelists in the Q&A box, and I would definitely encourage you to do that. And I will also moderate the discussion by posing questions to each of our speakers. Before we begin, I'm quickly going to introduce each of our speakers. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Claire Dupont. I'm Research Professor of European Governance at Ghent University in Belgium. Our speakers today come from the European Parliament, experience in the Commission, academia, and also the legal sector. So I'm very happy to welcome Jan Dupas, who is currently interim team leader of the ecological transition at the Greens in the European Parliament. Hello, Jan, and welcome. We also have Anaïs Berthier, who is a senior lawyer and head of ClientEarth in Brussels. Welcome, Anaïs. Charlotte Burns is here. She's the head of Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. Welcome, Charlotte. And Diederik Samson, who's a political strategist and also was the former head of the cabinet of Frans Timmermans at the European Commission. Welcome to you all. I would like to start with a very broad question that I hope will set a little bit the scene for our discussion. And I'm going to ask Charlie, if you could come in with your impressions to this question first, but each of our speakers will have the opportunity to respond to this one. And this question is very generally, why should we be concerned about the elections? Why should we expect that the elections will have an impact on the future of the European Green Deal? Charlie.
Thanks, Claire. And I was going to say, yeah, please call me Charlie. No one calls me Charlotte. Well, I think this is going to be a really interesting election. The evidence suggests that far-right and populist parties are going to do particularly well in this election. And generally speaking, those parties are far more sceptic on questions of climate change and the environment. There's a live question as to whether or not the election of the people who are elected, the MEPs who are elected from those groups, will be able to form themselves into coherent political groups. But assuming that they can, it might make it much more difficult for a sort of green centrist left majority in the European Parliament to form and secure majorities for legislation. So that's a key threat there potentially for the adoption of more progressive environmental legislation. There's also a risk, and we're sort of seeing this play out already, that if the right do well, the far right do well, that will pull existing centre-right parties further to the right as well, which again then reduces the political space available for green legislation to get through. And then there's sort of the further point that I think it's worth making is that if you see the right doing well, that will shape the willingness and ability of both the Commission and the European Council to push through ambitious and difficult legislation. I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact of the Green Surge in 2019 on shaping von der Leyen's mandate. And if we see a swing to the right, then that raises questions about the willingness and appetite for politicians at the European level to push through that implementation agenda that you've described so well. I'll stop talking now and let some of our other panelists come in.
Thank you, Charlie. Diederik, can I turn to you to get your impressions on this first question about our expectations for the future based on these elections?
Yeah, it's hard to predict, but it's safe to predict, unfortunately, that we won't see that green surge that Charlie was referring to, that was so instrumental in 2019. People have really underestimated what the impact was of young people going to the streets and going to the polling boxes to vote their way and to vote climate change on the agenda of the European Commission. But last time there was another ingredient, which was basically, you could call the brinkmanship of the European Council by putting von der Leyen forward out of nothing. And in order for her to secure a majority in the parliament, she had to lean all the way into a Green Deal commitment in order to get that majority. Well, we won't see both of that back. But apart from that, I'm not too worried. It's a missed opportunity if you do not provide new momentum to the Green Deal, but that's obviously a personal opinion from my side. But there is no reason to be despair about an enormous surge to the right. Yes, there will be one, but it won't be enormous, and it won't be enough to pivot the majorities in Parliament. So it comes down to the strength of the Green Deal itself. Partly to the strengths of the Green Deal itself, to see whether it will get another mandate, a stronger mandate, to succeed in the next commission. And I'm pretty optimistic about that. So yes, we won't see that green surge, which is a pity, but we also don't need to despair about a right-wing surge, because it won't be there.
Thank you, Diederik, for your impressions there. I might move straight to Jan about this, because both Charlie and Diederik have mentioned the interactions between different institutions. Perhaps you can give some view from the European Parliament side, how you see things.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And first, before I start talking, I have to say a little institutional disclaimer that I express here my personal views and not necessarily the views of the political group I work for. And now I've said it, so we can dig in. No, indeed, I mean, it is an important election, as both Charlie and Diederik said it. It is true that the polls, they are not evidence, Charlie, they are polls only so far, and we still have 1 month to turn things around. But indeed, the polls suggest a rise of the far right, of also more conservatives within the NPP. And this is, for us, clearly a big danger. I mean, we have had the Green Deal for the last 5 years. We may end up with a Brown Deal, not only because fossil fuels may be back on the table, but also because, well, dark political groups, let's say, that Europe has unfortunately seen in the past might come back in full strength in the parliament. But I would also agree with Diederik here that I don't think that there will be enough to swing completely majorities within Europe. Not only they have internal struggles within themselves, but also because I think what we will see is an even more fragmented European Parliament next time than we have seen in the last 5 years. And yes, it's true that 5 years ago, as Diederik said, I think the fact that von der Leyen was picked up a bit last minute by the European Council led to a situation where the Parliament had a lot of power to influence the agenda of von der Leyen for the next 5 years. But I think, von der Leyen won't be new this time around if she is again picked up by the European heads of states and governments to continue for another 5 years, which is also not a done deal. But if she is, she will still have to secure a majority. And what the polls say today is that there is no majority that goes from Renew to ECR or even ID. And I don't think ID will be part of any majority. So there is no majority Renew, EPP, ECR. SND finally, and I think I want to praise that as well, over the weekend said that they will never do a majority, not only with ID, but also with ECR. So it's very clear that the most likely to happen after the elections is that we will have to discuss with pro-EU, pro-democracy, pro-climate, and pro-human rights forces in the European Parliament. And that gives us a chance to have the Green Deal continue and being reinforced, but not only the Green Deal, we also, I hope today we'll also talk about the social aspect of the Green Deal, and that as Greens, we are advocating for a green and social deal. So I think there is still a lot of opportunity to put climate, just transition high on the agenda of the next Commission.
Thank you, Jan. Anaïs, if I can turn now to you, it would also be very interesting if you could give some input and thoughts on the fact that we're moving to an implementation phase. So what does this mean, the elections for the implementation phase, although both Diederik and Jan seem more positive about the potential future than maybe some other observers may be?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, I agree with part of what's being said. I mean, I think these European elections are critical. It is a turning point. The impact of the triple crisis, the climate change, the biodiversity loss, the pollution crisis we've never felt the impact of this crisis as strongly as today. It impacts our everyday life, the life of all the EU citizens. And so the members of the European Parliament that we will elect will shape the EU over the next 5 years and the next decade to come, and will have an impact on the present and future generation. It's very difficult to predict, but the predictions are not looking good. And we've actually already witnessing the backlash against the European Green Deal even before the election takes place. Unfortunately, throughout the last year, definitely started around the negotiation of the nature restoration law. Very opposition and passing environmental legislation and policies has become way more difficult. And so it does not augur well for the future. And so it will all depend, of course, on the outcome of the elections, on the alliances that will be made, as it's been said. But yeah, it's very, very concerning if you look at the state of the nature restoration law, but also of the calls from different member states and different lobbies to even start to revise some of the pieces of the legislation that has been already adopted under the European Green Deal, even before waiting for the outcome of the European election, with, unfortunately, the European Commission folding under that pressure with the recent, for example, illegal reform of the CAP. I think I will have the opportunity to come back on that and why we think it is illegal. And so we think it's concerning because it does not only weaken environmental legislation and policy and the European Green Deal, but democracy as a whole, and actually threaten our democratic safeguards, because the way we've been doing politics and the way European legislation has been adopted throughout the last year has drastically changed already and has undermined our democratic model. So I think that's what's at stake.
Thank you, Anaïs. You also raised some very interesting points that we'll surely come back to as the discussion advances. I'd like to turn back to Charlie, if I may, because one of the points that was just raised by Anaïs was about democracy more broadly. I'm wondering if you can describe how the situation that we're currently in Europe is a general trend that we see in other jurisdictions, or if you have an understanding of a broader, the broader implications of what's happening here and how this is a threat to climate and democracy in a broader sense. Do you have any reflections on this bigger picture?
Thanks, Claire. I mean, I suppose what I would say is that seeing a sort of, talking from the UK, seeing a populist surge against European and environmental policy is not that unsurprising. We've seen it in other contexts as well, though. So, and putting my academic hat on, one of the things that we've seen with environmental and climate policy more generally in the European context up until now is it's been treated as a valence issue. So it's been treated as an issue where everyone, broadly speaking, agrees that acting on climate or acting on the environment is a good thing and that people can get behind it. And what we're seeing now emerging is that it's being treated as a positional issue, where depending upon where you sit ideologically, that will shape your position on climate change or the environment. And we've seen that more broadly happening in America. We've seen it in Australia as well. So we're seeing those trends come back to the UK. I suppose the other places where we've seen it, I'm thinking Argentina in particular. So I think what we're seeing really is that the European Union is maybe catching up with some other jurisdictions where this has been a fairly present trend for the last 5 or 10 years. And we're beginning to see, which we haven't really seen before in discourse, a sort of a questioning of the science of climate change, or just a dismissal. Well, this might be true, but actually it's too expensive to act on this, so let's not worry about the climate. So yeah, I think it's part of a broader trend that's happening globally, which is quite worrying.
Thank you, Charlie. Diederik, can I ask how you would reflect on this in the context of the Commission presidential campaigns that are starting now? The notion that this is now a positional issue, as Charlie mentioned, there maybe is more political stakes to this issue, and that we can think about questioning the science. And of course, the scientists are saying this is a pivotal decade for our ability to respond to the climate and environmental crises.
Well, in order to make a precise analysis, I think you have to be a bit more precise about what is actually at stake within the Green Deal. Because if you look at the climate and energy pillar, there's no such thing as a positional issue. That might be different from other parts of the world, but if you look at the EPP, let's say take them as a benchmark, they haven't moved on climate in what I would call the wrong direction. They did, however, on biodiversity. So the biodiversity pillar of the Green Deal is under huge pressure or under threat. And there is a cynical and easy explanation for that. The climate and energy pillar has a business case, a real one, in terms of money and returns on investment. Birds and bees, biodiversity doesn't at all. So here's the explanation for the difference. The positive part of that story is that I'm not too worried about climate and energy, because specifically in Europe, that business case will only get stronger. We are an energy island in terms of expensive energy. And the only way to get out of that problem, is to invest ourselves out of that problem by investing into renewable assets, renewable energy sources. That's the only way to get more independence and cheaper energy. For biodiversity, it's a completely different story. And I agree with Charlie and others that say that that might get into a more of a cultural, positional, political issue, which would be bad in so many ways. We need to prevent that. We were doing that by trying to give a business case to biodiversity. And we've started that process. And you do that via the carbon content of nature. Everything that grows and blows, it creates or sequesters carbon, and that has a monetary value. So with a carbon removal certification, but that's just started. So if I would hope for anything, it's to get a license to operate out of these elections, to continue that. You were asking about the presidential campaign. I would argue that there is no such thing at the moment. So let's not spend that much energy on it. I mean, we still have the lead candidate type of process, but it's even more budged than the last time. So no, that's not going to be the issue. The issue is obviously after the elections, the positioning of the European Council in putting a president forward, and then the Parliament, and as we discussed before, that might result into a similar situation as last time, that the Parliament can really exert power over the next Commission mandate.
Thank you, Diederik. I'll pass straight on to Jan, because I think there, Jan, you can give some responses on the role of the Parliament in the future president of the Commission, and what the demands could be from a Parliament that, according to your analysis, may not be so unprepared as some of our other voices and analysts are saying when they look at the polls.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if we take a moment to reflect back on indeed what happened 5 years ago, I think it was the first time that indeed the Parliament was able to influence as much the Commission agenda in European history. And it was so because the four biggest political groups decided to discuss content rather than discuss top jobs. I mean, normally we would have European elections, the heads of states and governments, they will discuss among ourselves who should get what position and so on. They discuss a very vague and broad strategic agenda for the next 5 years, but that's about it. And indeed, last time around, thanks to the Green Wave and the fact that we came a bit also into the picture and disturbed a bit the usual way of working, but also indeed thanks to the fact, due to the fact that von der Leyen was quite new and had to secure a majority in very little time, we were able to really influence content. And I really hope so that we will continue doing so, because I think it was Sven Giegel who said in an event recently that what happened in 2019 was a proof that a European demos can exist and does exist, because indeed we had youth mobilization, people marching on the streets for weeks, for months, demanding climate action, and it translated into the polls and it translated into a policy agenda and a transformational agenda. So I think we're able to show 5 years ago that European policies and politics can work, a European demos can exist. And I think it would be a shame if we now, after the next election, we start going into our old habits of discussing only top positions and not really content. So I really hope that we will be able to really dig into the content and dig into what we want. As I said, we as Greens, we are advocating for not only a continuation of the Green Deal, but also a green and social deal. Because I think if I have one big regret of the last 5 years is that, yes, the just transition, leaving no one behind, was very much into the slogans, especially of your former boss, Didrik, and very much so. And I think, unfortunately, I would say that there was not so much concrete happening on that front. My only regret in that the two big social instruments that we had, the Just Transition Fund and the Social Climate Fund, they were designed mostly as a compensation or almost as a political bargain to convince recalcitrant member states. But unfortunately, there was not a really core just transition policy at the heart of Europe. And I think that's what definitely we will advocate for for the next 5 years.
Jan, would you mind if I push you a bit more on one of the points you just raised, which was when you compared to 2019, you saw youth protests on the streets, and today we're seeing farmers protest on the streets. So how does that then reflect in the campaign, the Parliament election campaign?
Yeah, I think indeed we see different people marching on streets. I think we also see different ways of those protests being organized. I mean, there's more and more research showing that those protests were not just happening by magic, but they were also organized by different political interests, by different economic interests. I'm not saying that this is happening all across Europe. I know that in France, the farmers' protests were actually much more, let's say, happening outside or aside the trade unions than what, for instance, we've seen in Brussels. But what we've seen in Brussels was clearly a well-thought and well-designed lobbying plan. And I'm a bit, I fully agree here with Anaïs. I mean, it led to this illegal reopening of the cap, which is really a shame. Not only because this is what has been proposed now will do nothing to improve the situation of farmers that have been allegedly protesting on the streets, but also because indeed it put at risk the way we are doing EU policy, and the fact that when we have a deal, we stick to the deal and we implement the deal. Now we have a huge negotiation and difficult negotiation. Didrik knows it as well. We had very long debates about the cap negotiation in the beginning of the mandate, and it was painful. We did not support the cap at the end of the day for many reasons. But we can only blame the fact that a few weeks before the elections, a commission comes without any impact assessment, binding all the legal rules set up in the cap, and just developing a political and ideological agenda, I have to say, which is just a reply to a few people marching and being a bit violent as well on the street. So I think the situation is very, very much different than it was 5 years ago. And I hope that, I know, I mean, it's not my first election. I know it always leads to a lot of polarization, a lot of agitation, but I really hope that after the elections we can keep our head cool and really focus on the content.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Anaïs maybe to reflect also on what Jan has just said. It would be interesting if you could elaborate a bit more in your comments earlier about the CAP reform and also potentially on the what you described as the backlash that we're now seeing, for example, also with the nature restoration law and the wider implications that you see for that in the context of now upcoming elections.
Sure. Yeah, well, it is really concerning. And as I said, the way EU legislation and EU environmental legislation has been adopted throughout the last year has really drastically changed. It's been really tough for us NGOs working on these laws as well and seeing some of them either being completely weakened either by some political parties in the European Parliament or by some member states. But also what's been striking is that the decision-making process, as we used to know it, for example, when the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council reached a deal within the trilogues, usually, that deal is respected. Here, you would see some member states reopening the deal at the last minute, the day before the vote, to continue imposing their wishes to weakening even more the law. I'm thinking of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that has been seriously weakened by some member states at the last minute after a deal had been reached to actually lower the number of companies which would be subject to the law. That law, which for those who haven't followed, requires and impose due diligence obligations on companies and impose them to identify, assess and mitigate the impact their economic activities have on the environment and human rights. We saw as well the whole discussion around the nature restoration law, where the EPP has really started to even wanting to not only to weaken the law, but to simply block it and block the discussions around the law. They haven't succeeded in the European Parliament, but now the law is still on hold in the Council because we still don't have a majority of member states supporting the adoption of the law, which is the main piece of the European Green Deal, addressing nature restoration. And that is crucial because we cannot address the climate crisis without addressing the biodiversity crisis. So the climate crisis, the topic of addressing the climate crisis is also at stake. Because we won't succeed addressing the climate crisis in adopting only the EU climate law and the Fit for 55 package. We also need to protect and restore nature. And some of the also really important legislative proposals have been dropped. The Sustainable Food System Law has been dropped, so we haven't carried out the transition to a sustainable food system. The reform of the REACH regulation has been dropped. The revision of the sustainable use of pesticide regulation has been dropped. And so all these initiatives that should have been adopted under the European Green Deal have been dropped. And last but not least, as if it was not enough, the European Commission decided, following the demonstrations of the farmers and mainly of the push from Copa-Cogeca, which is the union representing the farmers, but mostly the agro industry, Commission has just fallen under the pressure of that lobby to revise the CAP to get rid of the environmental conditionality that had been integrated into the CAP, which we thought was not even enough to address the impact agriculture has on biodiversity, on the soil, on water, on our health, and on climate as well. And why we say it is illegal, so for those who don't know, we are an environmental NGO composed of lawyers, so we use the law as our main tool. It is illegal because the European Commission has not even complied with its own internal rules, the better regulation guidelines. There was no impact assessment. There was no public consultation, except the consultation of 4 farmers' unions with the input of two of them being against actually getting rid of the environmental conditionality, and with the input of these two farmers' union not being even taken into account. But also even maybe more worrying is that it is in breach of the EU climate legislation. The very legislation that Mrs. von der Leyen said at the last debate, I've adopted the EU climate law, it now needs to be implemented, when the European Commission does not even comply with the European climate law. Why? Because that law actually requires the European Commission to carry out an assessment when they adopt a new legislative proposal, and to make sure that new legislative proposal is aligned with the commitment of the EU to actually achieve carbon neutrality. That hasn't been done. Now, when the CAP is being revised in 1 month under an emergency procedure, when actually the last revision of the CAP took 3.5 years. And knowing the impact has on climate and on biodiversity, that is very, very concerning, both for that shows the fact that addressing the triple crisis is not the priority of this European Commission. And as I was saying, because our democratic safeguards are not respected.
Thank you, Anaïs. Charlie, can I come back to you on this? Because you have done quite some interesting research in the past about environmental policy backsliding and the context within which that might happen. I'm wondering if you could give some first reflections on what Anaïs has just said.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's been quite interesting preparing for this, reflecting back on work that I did, looking at the likelihood of dismantling of policy. And it is very difficult to unpick European policy once it's been adopted. But what you can do is, yeah, look at implementation and, you know, and through using those measures, the scope to weaken legislation. The other point I suppose I'd make, and Anaïs hinted at this, and it's a slight, I really like Didier's positive outlook. However, I'm feeling a bit less positive, sorry. So he was saying that, you know, climate and energy policy, we're not going to see that moving. But actually, we're seeing really strong challenge on the rules around tailpipe emissions being reduced to 0 by 2035. We're seeing that play out in big, funnily enough, big car producing countries, especially Germany, and von der Leyen's own party, the CDU, has called for that to be set aside. So again, if we see, you know, there is a, I think it's unlikely that that will be unpicked, but I could see there being an extension of that deadline. And I suppose the other point I'd make, part of the reason why you get backlash and pressure to dismantle, while that might be unlikely to happen, we can see deadlines being extended or moved. And if you adopt ambitious legislation, but you don't think through all the sort of extra policies that need to be in place in order to implement those targets, that's when you run into issues. And we've seen that happening here in the UK and Scotland, where the Scottish government, I mean, things are imploding a bit in Scotland at the moment, but they walked back from their climate targets. And part of the argument of the Climate Change Committee here was that was because they adopted really ambitious targets and didn't think about how they were going to achieve them. So if we're thinking about getting rid of cars with combustion engines, we need to make sure that we have in place the appropriate manufacturing for batteries, EV infrastructure, so on and so forth. So I think there's also an argument here about the EU needing to make sure that when it puts in place policy, that it can be implemented at the national level.
Thank you, Charlie. I think these are showing also some of the pressures that exist currently and that we can expect potentially to be amplified in the context of the elections that are coming up. There's also a question in the Q&A, and I'd like to encourage all the participants to drop in their questions and we will address them as we can in the discussion. I want to address this one to both Jan and Diederik. Maybe Jan, you can take a first go at this. This is really this connection between climate and biodiversity that also has been mentioned a few times in our discussion. How do you think we can sell environmental action, including climate and biodiversity, better to the public and also across the political divide at EU level? That's a question from Alison. Jan, would you like to try?
Yes, sure. I mean, maybe I will not answer the question directly, but I think we also need to take a step back. I mean, I was looking to prepare for this this morning at the Eurobarometers, I think, which was issued like two months ago, a month and a half ago. Climate is still among the top 5 priorities of EU citizens for the European elections. I mean, there's a huge polarization of the political debate on climate and environment, but I don't think it necessarily translates into what citizens want and wish for. So I think we need to make a distinction between what politicians are debating and what people really want. And I don't think that we can necessarily explain the rise of the extreme right and the far right because of the Green Deal. I think there are many more factors that explains the rise of far right in Europe, and I don't think environmental legislation is one, or at least not the first and the main one. I think the main one is this feeling of, well, the rise of inequalities, social inequalities, this feeling of being abandoned, of being left aside, and this is not really the Green Deal doesn't have much to do about this. So I think, I'm not sure I answered directly the question, but I think we also need to take a step back and don't fall into the trap of saying that because the far right is on the rise, it means that citizens don't support climate action.
That raises another question for me that I will save until after I've given Diederik the opportunity to respond to this question about the idea of trying to sell environmental action to the public. You mentioned earlier about making a business case for biodiversity action. Perhaps you can elaborate a bit more on how you think these two can be combined in a public discourse.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and we spent a lot of time in our team thinking about the way to make this policy happen. And at first, you would be inclined to think that climate is less sellable to the public than biodiversity and nature. I mean, the ETS doesn't make anybody tick, while trees and flowers do a lot. It's unfortunately almost ironic that in policy terms, it's the other way around. And as I said earlier, the explanation for that is cynical and true. It's business case. So yes, you need to find a way to turn the restoration of Europe's nature into a business case. And that shouldn't be too difficult, because we argue, and that's a fact-based argument, that half of our GDP is based on nature. So if you destroy that, there must be a way to sell that literally to public and other stakeholders. And as I said, we are in the process of doing so with a carbon removal certification, whereby you give a value to restoring or increasing the amount of nature that we have. And I'm not too, if that's successful, and yes, you need a mandate for that, so the next election is important. But if that's successful, I'm not too worried about that part of things. I do want to challenge, though, what Jan said about the Green Deal not being part of the equation in terms of the political rise of the right, because there's one overarching factor that gives impetus to the far right, and that's called anxiety. Anxiety in society about fast change, about indeed the anxiety to be left behind in that fast changing world. And fast change is all about the Green Deal. This is the biggest industrial revolution that mankind ever saw. And we know from past industrial revolutions that they are intrinsically Darwinistic in nature, so they are unfair. Industrial revolutions always end up with more money and more power in the hands of less people. So yes, you need policies to make up for that, and therefore I fully support the ambition to have a just or a social deal, because that's all about redistribution. And obviously, I'm biased here, but I do think that the Green Deal did quite a good job on, let's say, the money part of the redistribution, with the Social Climate Fund and the Cohesion Fund and Next Generation EU. And there's heaps of money around to redistribute the consequences of the Green Deal. But I've come to the conclusion that redistribution of money is not the essential part of it. It's about redistribution of perspective, about optimism, about hope. People voting for the far right lack optimism, lack hope, lack perspective. And that's not their own fault. That's society's doing. And we need to find a way to redistribute those assets much more eloquently and effectively than we do. And politicians are not that good in redistributing hope and perspective. So that's our real challenge. And we won't overcome that challenge in the next 5 to 10 years. So we have to live with the fact that, yes, this is an uphill battle towards a more sustainable planet. And still, I'm optimistic that we will win that battle.
Thank you, Diederik. Jan, I would like to come back now to the question that I had in mind from your points, which I think will be a nice follow-on from also Diederik's comments, which is when you were referring to the Eurobarometer and how, you know, climate is still a top 5 issue, but the polarization is in political discourse. Is it not the political level's responsibility, the political community's responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen or to reflect the wishes of the people? How do you see that as, say, a mission or an objective in the parliament towards the next elections?
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely, I think it's a huge responsibility. And I would say, yeah, at the moment, mostly with the EPP and even with von der Leyen, and we just talk about the illegal reopening of the cap. I mean, it's a huge responsibility to, again, keep our heads cool. I think we need to indeed, and I agree with Diederik, I mean, politicians are not necessarily always good at providing hope when they talk about the climate. And this is something we all need to work on. But for instance, when I look at what Biden has done with the US Inflation Reduction Act, he was talking as much as, if not more, about creating local jobs than saving the climate. It was a massive investment plan to keep jobs in Europe. And I have to say, I think, indeed, you know, when I hear people saying, yeah, jobs are at risk in Europe because of the Green Deal. Yes, jobs are at risk in Europe, but not because of the Green Deal, because China and the US are being very aggressive in trying to attract investors. China is being very aggressive, very strategic in trying to build up a monopoly and ownership on the whole supply chain of net zero technologies, the future of our economy. And to those that want to oppose the Green Deal, those are the ones that will destroy jobs in Europe. I think continuing with the Green Deal, making sure that we are investing in net zero technologies within Europe is going to create local jobs, not the other way around. So I think this is indeed something that, and the Greens, we are also using that argument very strongly now in the campaign, and I hope that this argument can be also used, you know, not only with the Greens, but with others as well. And I have to say here, indeed, I think the EPP has a huge responsibility in the polarization of our political debates lately and over the last year, and I highly regret so. You know, I usually, we hear quite a lot in the EU bubble, you know, you Greens didn't vote for the climate law, so, you know, you are completely lunatics and radicals and whatsoever. Yes, we didn't vote for the EU climate law, and I think we had good reasons for that. And I think the EU Advisory Board on Climate Change proved us right that indeed 55% is not in line with science. So I think we were right to not vote in favor of the European climate law. But when I look at all the rest, I mean, we voted in favor of CO2 cars, EPP did not. We voted in favor of CO2 trucks, EPP did not. We voted in favor of the EPBD, EPP did not. We voted in favor of the natural restoration law, we talked about it before, EPP did not. We voted in favor of air quality. I can continue on and on and on. I think the force that has been very constructive in the last 5 years to implement and to adopt the Green Deal were definitely the Greens, not so much the EPP. So if someone is to be blamed for radicalization and polarization of the political debate, I think I have quite of an answer to
that. Thanks, Jan. I'm going to maybe, rather than engaging in the blame discussion, maybe we can move to the next stage of the strategy for the elections. I'm wondering if I could turn to Charlie for this question. There's another question in the chat, which is thinking about the need to define priorities I'm wondering if you can speak from your research on this as well. This is a question from Sebastian Obertu. Does the emphasis need to be on exploiting synergies and overlaps with the industrial policy agenda, for example, or other policy agendas? Because if we're in a situation where the environment and climate agenda is not the central priority of the campaign and not the central political priority, as we have heard also from Anaïs, then how does that campaign continue? How does that message continue to get through? Charlie, if you could reflect on that for us, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good question, and it strikes me that that might be one of the outcomes after the election, if we do see this sort of rightward shift, is that rather than stepping away from climate policy, the discourse that's mobilised will be a different one. So it will be that more, well, I don't want to say more positive, because that implies that the agenda is not positive already, but trying to articulate the climate goals in relation to energy policy, in relation to industrial policy, in relation to job creation, to give us sort of a positive story about the Green Deal. Now, obviously, lots of people would say that the European Green Deal has already had that sort of more positive story to articulate. But looking at some of the statements that have been made by parties during this election campaign. One that struck me was from the leader, the Spitzenkandidat for Renew, who said that the growth element of the European Green Deal has not been there and has not been emphasised enough. So that re-emphasis on green growth and then, as Sebastian has suggested, linking up with other areas of policy, it strikes me could provide that more positive narrative that Alison was hinting at. I would say as well, and Diedrich, sorry, I think I renamed you Didier earlier. Apologies for that. That idea that we should be thinking about commodifying nature and bringing that discourse to nature, I don't think that really plays into what the public are worried about. So I think if we're trying to get that more positive narrative, we need to think about what people are concerned about, and also from the sort of just transition element, think about who's negatively affected by climate change, for example, and then try and develop or emphasise policies that directly address those questions.
Thank you. I'm wondering if I can ask Anaïs a question about recognising the concerns of citizens maybe more. We've seen also quite a lot of litigation with regard to climate, I think somehow less on nature issues, but certainly on climate change in various countries and now also at the European Court of Human Rights. I'm wondering if you have any reflections on that as a means for public expression of concerns that should be taken seriously or more seriously at the political level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I really agree with Jan about the fact, and I think we all agree about that, we really need to integrate way more the social element into the green policies that are adopted and assess way better and plan way better as well, actually, the impact of the green policies on social issues. And that should be done more systematically and better, maybe at the stage of the impact assessment that is done by the European Commission. And they're already supposed to do that, but that's not really being done sufficiently. And it's really important because we need to get the buy-in of the general public. We need to get their support if you want to continue to adopt and implement ambitious environmental legislation, because otherwise that's exactly why they will be voting for the far right, or they will create social unrest, like the Mouvement des Gilets jaunes, which exactly started because of a tax imposed on oil that hadn't been well planned ahead. The same for the farmers. They should not have to choose between their health and making a living. Actually, it would be to the industry to find alternatives to toxic pesticides and to the decision makers to make sure that these are used. But for to make sure that we get more buy-in from the general public, we also need to support way more the more vulnerable part of the population, which is the one that is the most impacted by the triple crisis as well. And so to do that, we need to support vulnerable households through deep energy efficiency, renovation of buildings, tackling fuel, energy and transport poverty as well. But to reply more to your question in terms of individual and litigation, indeed, well, we know that lack of correct implementation and enforcement of environmental legislation on the ground is one of the key barriers to actually ensuring that the EU environmental policy delivers on the ground and actually improve the lives of everyone. And to make sure that we improve this implementation and this enforcement, we need to empower civil society more. And the way to empower them amongst one way amongst the other is also to make sure that they have access to justice in environmental matters, that they have access to the courts to actually challenge the breaches of environmental law, since unfortunately all the great laws that have been adopted under the European Green Deal and before are still not implemented. And so it is really, really important to make sure that that they have access to the courts, to also substitute themselves to public authorities when these actually do not fulfill their role in enforcing environmental legislation, and that's often the case. Often as well because these enforcement bodies are understaffed, under-resourced. Sometimes you have only 1 or 2 persons at national level to monitor, for example, the illegal import of timber under the EU timber regulation and now the deforestation legislation. Or you have only 2 persons monitoring the correct implementation of the fishing control regulation in some of the biggest ports in Europe. So that's really, really important that citizens can play their role and in enforcing this environmental legislation through giving them access to justice and also compensation rights. So the European Commission has started actually to integrate access to justice provision into sexual legislation, and that's really good. They need to do it more systematically because sometimes they forget. And they've started as well to integrate compensation rights so that individuals can actually claim compensation when they are victims of pollutions due to breach of legislation. There is one first provision that has been integrated into the Industrial Emissions Directive. So that's progress. And that's also a way to empower the citizen on the ground.
Thank you so much, Anaïs. I'm going to jump to another question in the chat, which is, so Anaïs, you were discussing mostly the participation at the implementation level, but there is also, again, this is from Alison, a question about participation in the policy making process. So this could be about deliberative democratic processes or other participative mechanisms. I'm wondering if I can turn to Jan as someone to respond to this. I'd love to have other members of the panel maybe also think about this question. Do the panelists think that better public participation could play an important role in breaking down the opposition to progressive policies?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely all up for participatory democracy. And I think it's very important. I think it's not that easy to do it at the European level in a scale and in a way that is always efficient. I mean, we had this European, what was it called? The European Convention or whatever, Citizens Convention, 2 years ago. It ended up to barely nothing. I mean, great ideas, but no political translation. We have seen also in France how the Convention Citoyenne turned out. So I'm definitely all up for it, and I think we should invest much more in this. I'm always a bit afraid of it being used mostly by politicians as the way to legitimize their own policies rather than listen really to the concerns and to the wish of citizens. I think there are other ways of empowering citizens, though. I mean, when we talk about the energy transition, I think we should invest much more in citizen energy communities. There are ways of making sure that citizens that want to engage in the transition, we facilitate the job for them to do so. Be it via helping them for more of the juridical system, a legal system, be it by having reduced taxes, many ways to empower citizens to basically take their future in their own hands, and making sure that Europe is there to facilitate that. I think I would even say that it has maybe an even bigger potential than parliamentary participatory democracy, which in the past, let's say, at least haven't had many successes. So I would rather even maybe focus on that more. And I think it's also maybe easier to convince other political groups of the benefits of such empowerment of citizens in the energy transition than talking about participatory democracy.
Can I turn to you, Diederik, to reflect also on this, given also the experience at the EU level, which I know the EU is not the closest to local citizens, of course. And then I'm going to ask you afterwards to respond to another question from the chat, but perhaps you can begin with that one.
Yeah, obviously, I guess we all are extremely faithful to the idea of having new ways of participatory democracy, etc. We all acknowledge the flaws of the current system that we have. But you have to give me some rope here. At the beginning of the mandate in 2019, we had a challenge of making the biggest new set of policy ever made by the European Commission. So the Green Deal, Fit for 55, climate law and everything. If you would have asked us to also make that new policy in a completely new way, I think you would have overloaded the boat and it would have sunk. So we made the deliberate choice to at least secure the fact that we would propose all those new policies in a successful way and get them to the old system, the trilogues and all that matter. Adjacent to it, next to it, we also developed things like the Climate Pact with the climate ambassadors and all the other stuff. But then I have to agree with Jan that the European institutions simply suck at making that happen. So we spent truckloads of money on it. There's huge communication budgets, but it's just cumbersome on a European level. I would argue that if you want to find a level to have those participatory democracies go to the lowest possible level, and maybe increase it to national level. I mean, the Irish example is great. The French example is worse, but still, but European examples, they're hard to find.
Thanks for that. I'm going to ask you, Diederik, again to take the floor just to answer the question from Boyam Kim, which is about the EU's international diplomacy. So a question, what could be done more to harness the EU domestic green surge that happened to link the domestic and international level green transition? So what's the EU's role here in diplomacy and how does that look to the future?
Well, potentially it's enormous, but to harness that potential is quite a stretch. And you can do it in two ways. We tried both, one of them much more successful than the other. The first way is obviously to strengthen your diplomatic powers. So to strengthen the representations all over the world and the delegations of the European Union, which is cumbersome, expensive, but necessary, and slowly but steadily it's bearing some fruit. The other way is design a policy that freaks out the rest of the world and makes the rest of the world talk about climate change. And we did with CBAM, which was one of the most effective policy tools in the last 50 years, international diplomacy tools, I mean, in the last 50 years of the European Union. Every conversation we had in the last 5 years with external stakeholders, so from outside of the Union, number 1, 2, and 3 on the agenda was CBAM. First, to express their worries. Secondly, to be keen on learning how to avoid paying CBAM. And the best way to avoid it is obviously to introduce carbon pricing yourself. And guess what happens? All over the world, those discussions and even real implementation is starting. So I think that sets an example of how the European Union could perform its international responsibilities by finding more tools and policies like CBAM. And there are a lot of them. If we have the political will the guts, because it requires some audacity to do so, because you, first of all, you confront a lot of external stakeholders that you rather be friends with. But for CBAM, we were bold enough to do so. So I would encourage ourselves to find new courage to do more of that. Because again, it's hugely successful, and a less prominent example, because we lack the audacity there, is the deforestation initiative. If we would have treated the deforestation initiative the same way, with the same stubbornness and the same commitment as we did for CBAM, it would have brought us further than we are right now. We can still do that, though, for the next mandate.
Anaïs, can I invite you to maybe reflect also on this, the external dimensions of EU internal policy? You had also mentioned earlier some intervention in some of your interventions about timber and deforestation as examples, where there's probably a lack of enforcement. So do you think that there is an interaction between the external effects or the possible external effects of internal policy and implementation?
Well, yeah, definitely, because compliance with the law is also a question of people's trust having the EU and their European institutions. And compliance with the rule of law also guarantees the credibility of the EU at all levels, at national level, at European level, at international level. And so there is, of course, an impact, and the EU has been leading with the European Green Deal on the international scene to ensure, to adopt the most ambitious legislation to address the triple crisis. And so it should continue, because otherwise we will just simply lose the leadership on that front. And that's what's been happening, unfortunately, the last year. So I really hope, and I'd like to be as optimistic, and I hope it's not going to stop, because it's really about that. It's really about playing with the credibility of the whole of the EU in not complying with these processes, in rollbacks, and in also in the way to adopt legislation. And I think one of the biggest threats is actually, that is also undermining the credibility of the EU on the international scene and at all level, is the disinformation. I think it has become one of the biggest risks, and that leads to deregulation. And the reason for that is just short-termism. We lack long-term vision among our decision makers. And that's a pity, because that's exactly what the European Green Deal was about. For once, it was about, planning, having this holistic approach. And now with the backlash, that's what's at stake. And it's the credibility of the EU that is at stake with this, with the risk that legislation and decisions are not adopted on the basis of verifiable and facts and science anymore, but decisions are adopted on the basis of fear-mongering and disinformation campaigns that are run by certain political parties and stakeholders. And so yeah, and in relation to the European deforestation regulation, unfortunately, you hear some member states and Copa-Cogeca who are also calling, and recently the Agriculture Commissioner calling on Mrs. von der Leyen to delay the implementation of the deforestation legislation, which was also a masterpiece under the European Green Deal. And so we'll see what will happen, but that's really concerning, and that's going to undermine the trust that European citizens have in the EU, but also that beyond the EU, the trust and the credibility that the EU will have. And so we see more and more with that disinformation threat leading to deregulation. Also, that the argument that to address regulatory burden, and the new argument as well is used to deregulate, is to the need to simplify the regulatory framework, right? So instead of pretending to reduce regulatory burden and instead of pretending to simplify regulatory obligations, decision makers, both at EU level and at national level, should actually start to address the cost of inaction and the pressure it puts on our economy. Because I think climate change has already cost the EU around, is it 145 billion throughout the decade? And so the cost of the transitions are significantly, substantially lower than the cost of inaction that in the end we all bear. So yeah, and so the leadership that we had with the European Green Deal on the international scene is what is at stake. And it's a pity because there is really extensive evidence, including studies from the OECD, which is not known to be a leftist organization, that really shows that environmental legislation really has a clear added value on the well-being of the population, on health, which according to the recent Eurobarometer is, I think, put as a priority concern by the European citizens, and that actually evidence that environmental legislation does not create unnecessary burdens. On the contrary, the OECD study even shows that the stringency of environmental policies actually doesn't harm productivity and growth if we want to continue encouraging growth, which I don't think we should. But even the Commission's high-level group on administrative burdens has found in its most recent report that environmental policy accounts for less than 1% of all administrative burden in the EU. So we see what disinformation can do and can lead to. And so that's really what's at stake.
Thank you, Anaïs. I think, again, you raised so many very interesting points. Also, in terms of the cost of inaction, this is something that's becoming very clear. And the World Meteorological Organization released a report saying that impacts from climate events cost the EU 13 billion just in 2023 alone. And so we have this as a growing problem. But I also wanted to come back to the point you made about short-termism, disinformation, and I'm going to address the next question to Charlie. So in relation to this idea of short-termism, which is kind of built into many of our democratic systems, but also disinformation, there's a question from Karen Beckstrand on the right-wing populist parliamentary candidates, their promise, for example, to abandon legislation under the European Green Deal, particularly the Fit for 55 legislation package. Is that mostly just a hot air that's mobilizing domestic constituencies, or is it really a real risk that parts of the Fit for 55 package may be rolled back? Seeing that we've seen some backlash on the nature agriculture sectors, but can we rely on the fact that Fit for 55 is resilient? Charlie, do you have some ideas there?
Yeah, I'm always really reluctant to predict when asked a question like this because I have made that mistake before. So what I will do is point to existing evidence, and existing evidence suggests that it's very hard to dismantle policy at the European Union level. So to that extent, we could probably say it's hot air, but it's hot air that could have a distinctly cooling effect on ambition coming after the election. So I think it's unlikely that we'll see those elements of Fit for 55 that have already been adopted rolled back. What we might see is passive dismantling, so those elements not being particularly well implemented at national level and then not rigorously enforced at the European level. So I can see that happening. I can see there might be some technical adjustments when any updated policies come forward, or a reluctance to bring forward updates on the grounds that that might open up the opportunity for unpicking or weakening legislation. And then, yeah, for those areas of Fit for 55 that haven't yet been adopted, and I think there's a handful of pieces of legislation that aren't there yet, it might be that those do get shelved or we see weaker versions coming through. So while I'm reluctant to predict on the basis of the evidence of what we've seen previously, that would be my suggestion of what's likely to happen. But I'm very happy for everyone else. No, actually, I don't think I am happy for everyone else to disagree with me because I don't want to see it being unpicked, but that would be my view.
Jan, would you have any reflections on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I also would not like that to be unpicked. I think I do agree. I mean, there is this sort of path dependency that it's difficult to dismantle EU legislation, but I wouldn't rule out completely that it is possible. I think it would be a shame, though, because not only, I mean, for the many benefits that those legislation would have for climate, environment, air quality, health, and others, but also because I think what even the industry is saying is that we need predictability. We need to know where we are going. And investors are saying exactly that. We need to know where we are going. And if you start changing the rules every 2 years, we can't do it. And we will need massive investment in a relatively short time frame to meet our climate and environmental objectives. And I think, yeah, we definitely need to provide that certainty. You know, I'm always a bit, yeah, highly frustrated, definitely, and always quite surprised when I hear, you know, within the EPP, again, people saying, oh, maybe we should reopen 2035, phase out of combustion engines. Well, the industry doesn't want it. If you know, the CEO of Volkswagen said, please don't reopen. This will be the huge industrial mistake. So indeed, I think that, as I said before, we are seeing a lot of polarization and populism in Europe rising. But let's keep our heads cool and let's look at the facts. So let's look at what is good, not only for this industry, but let's look at what is also good and needed for maintaining and creating jobs in Europe. And I hope that we can still have this constructive discussion that we have had over the last 5 years with ups and downs. Of course, we have all our disagreement. We come from a different standpoint. But I think we managed constructively to engage, and I'm quite proud of what we did all of the last 5 years. So I hope that we can continue that discussion with constructive forces after the elections. Yeah.
Can I build on your discussion there about the investments needed? Because we have also a question in the chat from Rosella Palmieri about the need for this sort of investment in the context of the EU's ambition to enlarge towards its eastern neighborhood. How do you see all this hanging together?
No, indeed, we have great challenges. I mean, clearly the climate crisis, environmental crisis, pollution crisis is one, but we also need indeed to enlarge. We need to support our partners in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in Georgia, that are fighting for the same values as we are fighting, and we have been building Europe for that for the last decade. So definitely, this is going to require a lot of investments, but I think. Yeah, that's we need to be a bit more creative, and that's really a shame again that at the moment, I think if you ask the parliament across the board, you would have people supporting an investment plan for Europe for the next 5 years. I think the problem lies in the member states, and I really hope that we can unlock this problem. And that's why I also hope that again the Parliament will be able to influence greatly the agenda for the next 5 years, and not only let the European councils do that, because it's clear that if you only listen to the heads of states and government, they will not want to build up this massive investment plan. But we definitely do need to have this investment plan, as I said, both for the climate, the environment, the pollution crisis, but also indeed for enlargement.
Diederik, how would you reflect on that same question? Do you agree with Jan's diagnosis?
Yes. Well, actually, an investment challenge is always what's at stake in every election or every thing. It's about what you need to invest in. And for Europe, it's actually a pretty simple thing. We need to invest in a new energy system and we need to do that in the next 10 years. As I said earlier, we are an energy island at the moment, having an expensive and shortfall of energy at the moment. We need to invest ourselves out of that problem. And guess what? We can't do that on our continent alone because we are simply with too rich on too small a piece of planet to solve our energy problem just on European soil. So we need our neighbors, the neighborhood, which is the eastern neighborhood, Ukraine and some other small countries that still not part of the European Union yet, and Northern Africa. And the good part of the story is, if we pick up that challenge, put our commitments to it, we solve not only the energy crisis, but also the two big challenges ahead of us in the next 10 years, which is Ukraine and its membership and migration. So we could make one overarching plan for the next decade for Europe to invest in our own energy future, or you could call it the oxygen for society, because that's what energy is, our energy future, but also in our taking responsibility for our neighbors, solving that headache, which is called how to make Ukraine a member of the European Union, and the other headache, which is how to stem or how to challenge or how to channel the migration crisis that is indeed causing the other part of anxiety in society at the moment. So the Green Deal could be even more part and parcel of the European future policies than it already is.
Thank you. So you have an integrative kind of view of the Green Deal as a springboard for other sorts of neighborhood policies, which does imply a lot of investment. I think this is going to reflect on the last question that we have in the chat, and I'm going to invite Charlie to answer this first, but I think I'd like everybody to reflect on this. In the discussions that we've had, we've talked about investment, we've talked about the need for a social transition, we've talked about the need for citizens being on board. Many of these aspects, as Karen Beckstrand highlights in the chat, are not necessarily communicated in member states. So, for example, if we have a right-wing turn in many of our member states, the EU is then not necessarily communicated as a solution to the sorts of problems that are being raised in the political discourse at national level. So as Karen says here, the EU is maybe communicated as a leftist and regulative body with an expanding social and distributive approach, rather than the more right-wing political policy agenda, which is about entrepreneurship or competition, and maybe even as far as nationalist perspectives. So is this emphasis of, for example, the social dimensions of the EGD or the investment dimensions that you've just spoken about, is this in collision with the public mood? Charlie, could you go first? And then I'd love if everybody else could have some comments on this.
So again, coming from the UK, you can see a wry smile on my face about the sort of, the thinking about, Europe regulating too much. That all sounds very familiar. I suppose one way of thinking about this is, what do we mean by the public mood, and why do people vote in European elections, and how many people vote in European elections? So we might see the right doing well in European elections, but turnout for elections has traditionally been quite low. 2019, we kind of saw an increase for the first time in many years in the numbers of people turning out to vote, but it was still only 50% Europe-wide, and in some countries it was still very low. And then why are people voting for the right in those European elections? Is it about the EU, or is it about what's going on domestically? And it's likely to vary across Europe from country to country. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that a swing to the right represents I think it could be the case that the swing to the right is being exaggerated in European elections. That said, we can see in lots of national elections the right are doing well there as well. And I think probably if the EU takes seriously its commitment to democracy, then leaders will need to take account of that. I don't think that means you need to abandon the European Green Deal, but I think it means that leaders will need to think very carefully about which aspects of the European Green Deal they want to pursue, and are there other elements of the sort of broader package that the Commission puts together that will be emphasised more. So whether or not that's Ukraine, whether or not that's the deregulation agenda again, whether or not a big thing that seems to be coming out on the right is around small and medium-sized enterprises. So is it emphasising those kind of policies more? And again, perhaps being a little bit more strategic and clever about how environmental policies are represented. And I suppose it comes back to Diedrich's point about, can you sell some of this as being business friendly? Can you link up with other areas of policy? And just think a little bit more carefully about how it's being packaged. Because in 2019, there was a need to package it to appeal to the Greens, who are, significant power in the European Parliament, and that sort of green surge. So it might be that in response to a right surge that thinking about how it's presented and the emphasis that should be put should be shifted.
Diedrich, can I ask you to come in to reflect on this? Is the EU moving further from the public mood in the context of national elections?
Well, to a certain extent, it is, and that's also exactly what its role is. Sometimes, I mean, there's this unwritten social contract or political contract that the European Union is a shield for national politicians in trouble. At some point, a national politician is in trouble, and he has the right to, and actually, we are there for him to be pointed at, to say, okay, I don't like this either, but it's because of Brussels. There is a fragile balance there, though. I mean, it's because of Brussels, you have to appeal to citizens to a higher interest, a more common interest. And most citizens, if not all citizens, do understand that. However, if a politician at every corner of the street says it's because of Brussels, those stupid bureaucrats over there, you create a Brexit. Because at that point, when you're in real trouble, you cannot point at Brussels anymore as a shield for your trouble, because you've destroyed your shield. And this fragile balance is there to keep. And obviously, a surge to the right will make it more difficult, because it will be tempting for many more politicians to slam Brussels instead of using it as a shield. And obviously, I rely on brave politicians on national level to not destroy this shield. And by the way, there's nothing new to it. Local politicians do the same for pointing at a national level. So this is what politics is about, and it's actually functional, because you appeal to the sense of a common interest at citizens level, and most citizens do understand that. But however, as I said, you can also destroy it, as we've seen with the Brits. Luckily, that seems to be a one-off, so let's keep it for the future.
Thank you. Jan, would you like to reflect on this? Also in the context of the remarks you made earlier about the member states being the problem when it comes to investment.
Yeah, I think, I started my first intervention, I think, in saying that, what happened 5 years ago was a proof that a European demos can exist. I think the fact that we are talking about the European Green Deal as core and center of these elections, not only in Brussels, but in many member states, is a proof that indeed this politicization of Europe is happening. And well, again, I was looking at this Eurobarometer, and I think from what I've seen is, of course, we don't have numbers of people that will be voting in the European elections of participation of 80% or so. That would be a dream. But I think we also don't have this in national elections either, right? Or in many member states, at least we don't have this anymore either. But I think what we see is that people are not turning against Europe. I think they are very much interested in what we are doing. And I think one of the great success, I think, of the last commission was indeed to be very political and to really be there to react and to propose measures to try to solve issues of citizens. I mean, we've seen it with the COVID crisis, with the energy crisis. Nothing is perfect. There's much more to be done. But I think, or let's say, I don't think we would have had that under Barroso or Juncker. So this is a step in the right direction, and I want to be, as we are closing this event, a bit more positive also for the next 5 years. I think people are interested about European politics, are interested about what Europe does. I think they need to better understand, and we as EU politicians or people working for EU institutions or around EU institutions, I'm not a politician myself, but we need to indeed be slightly better at explaining what we do and why European action is important. But I think I would be a bit more optimistic that I think people are concerned, and people I think will turn out to vote, and then we will of course see what the result of the elections are.
Thank you. Anaïs, could I ask you to reflect also on this, the connection between member states and EU level, but also in connection to a last question that just came in with regard to the credibility that the EU can have, since it hasn't managed to advance on all of its EGD promises?
Sure. Yeah, no, on the first question, well, I think it's difficult to really understand what the public mood is, because as Jan said, I agree with him. If you look at the Eurobarometer, I mean, they seem to be interested in the European election and understand as well the need to continue being part of the EU. I think it's always been existing, that democratic deficit at EU level, and also the lack of understanding because of the lack of explanation that is being provided to the general public about what the EU can do for you and how it works and what they actually do. And with the double speech that Diderot touched upon by the member states always blaming Brussels as if it was an institution, when they adopt legislation that are seem to be too burdensome. I think as well that the debate that is going on at political level does not necessarily reflect as well what the population is looking for. And one point that I agree with Jan as well, and that is really interesting, and that I don't think a lot of people know outside the Brussels bubble, is that part of the industry is actually calling for more legislation, is actually supporting part of the European Green Deal as well. For example, if you take the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, I mean, there's been plenty of business and investor statements that have been published in favor of the adoption of the law, in favor of the need to transition to a more sustainable economic model as well. And really, if you read the statements, it's really interesting to see that they state the fact that that law, for example, would make the largest businesses on the single market future-proof, because respecting people and the planet is the only way of doing business properly. Despite the fact that they recognize that this law is very demanding and groundbreaking, because it requires them to do some due diligence that they didn't have to do before. So I think it's more nuanced and more mixed. On the second question, because the EU hasn't adopted every initiatives under the European Green Deal, what about the credibility of the EU? Well, I think, I mean, we still need to recognize that really, really important legislation have been adopted. The deforestation legislation, the corporate sustainability due diligence, the revision of the air quality directive, the Fit for 55, the EU climate law. So that's not nothing, of course. We are disappointed because we were expecting more. We were expecting the farm to fork strategy to deliver. We were expecting the chemical strategy to deliver. But I mean, it is a very, very good start, I would say.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of this panel. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank Diederik, Jan, Charlie, and Anaïs for all of your fascinating insights, and also to the participants, the audience who were so engaging with your questions, and to the VUB and the team at GreenDeal-NET there, who did an excellent job of organizing this panel. So thanks to you all. Before we finally close, I wanted to ask each of our 4 panelists if they could highlight one keyword that they would think as the point that they want to emphasize as the challenge for the next few years in the context of the elections for the European Green Deal. And I'm just going to go in order as I see you on the screen. So Jan, can you let me know what would be your keyword when you're thinking about summarizing the challenge for the future of the EGD?
There are many challenges, but I think one is investment. I mean, again, the New Deal in the US in the 30s, it was not about norms, it was not about regulation, it was about investment, creating local jobs and transforming society, the American society. I think we have had a lot of norms, a lot of regulation, not enough investment, so that should be our priority for the next 5 years. Okay, investment. Charlie?
Marketability, being able to sell it to the public.
Marketability, excellent. Anaïs?
Sorry, I was on mute. Well, I would just see the main challenge, in addition to what has already been mentioned, disinformation, as I said. Not having science-based decisions.
Thank you. Diederik?
Biodiversity. That as the lacking pillar for the next 5 years.
Okay, I think we know where there is work to be done. Thank you all so much for your participation and excellent insights. I wish you all a very good end to your afternoon. Bye-bye.